I'm Willie Stewart. I'm a neuropathologist working in Glasgow, and I am particularly interested in brain injury and how it can change how the brain functions for people moving forward from the point of injury onwards. And I'll explain a bit how we get into that in my talk. So I'm going to talk a bit about the rugby and football cohorts which have been added into the Prevent Dementia programme, and they were mentioned a bit this morning. And so my job is to kind of explain how we got to introducing these cohorts to our study and just very lightly touch on where we think we're going to be with the data in the next few months. I'm going to do that as quickly as possible because the more important part of this session is that we're bringing forward a couple of our participants from the rugby study who are legends of the game of rugby. And I'm allowed to say that. I'm sure they would be a bit more humble than that, but they're legends of the game of rugby. And I'm delighted that they would come and chat to us so they can explain a bit about how they got into study and why they've come forward to join us. In terms of the background to this, you'll know that this crops up a lot in the news at the moment about the relationship between sport and lifelong brain health. And I normally don't have to go too far back in the news to find an item which relates to this. And actually that last one, concussion in football, dangers known for decades, say former players suing the governing bodies, was actually from the last 24 hours, where lawyers representing some of these players feel they found evidence that football knew about this in the 80s. So it's a topic which comes up a lot, and there's litigation pending, and there's all sorts of issues around it. But although we were hearing a lot about it in the news now, it's a subject that we in this field have had a sense of for considerably longer than that. And for over 100 years, we've had a knowledge that boxers may develop lifelong brain health problems from participation in that sport. And to be honest, for almost 100 years, we kind of thought, well, what did you expect? If you're going to participate in a sport where the quickest way to achieve a victory is to inflict a brain injury on your opponent, then you shouldn't be too surprised if later in life that leads to problems. And so for really much of the last century, we recognised this problem in boxers. We called it the punch-drunk syndrome, or if we wanted to be really clever, we called it dementia pugilistica, boxers' dementia. But that changed just about 20 years ago when a colleague working in America conducted a post-mortem on a former American football player, and he found a pathology which he thought looked just like what we were seeing in boxers. He saw this boxer's dementia pathology, but this man wasn't a boxer, he was an American footballer. And so he thought, well, dementia pugilistica isn't really a useful term here. So he dug around in the literature and he found another term called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and I can usually only say that once a day. So from now on, we'll just call it CTE. So he found this CTE in the literature, and he thought, well, that sounds a bit more like, there's less boxers, it's more wider brain injuries, so I'll call it CTE. So he introduced us to this concept that actually this problem we'd recognised in boxers could be a problem for wider sports and wider exposures to brain injury. But at that point, 20 years ago, although we suddenly recognised this might be a problem for other people exposed to head injury and head impacts, we as pathologists, my community, didn't really know what to look for. We hadn't defined it as a disease, defined it as a pathology. And so we had to go through a process around about 10 years ago where many of us got together in Boston, right about this time of year, and we sat in a room, went for beers in the evening, came back the next morning, and decided amongst us what we felt distinguished this disease. And what we felt distinguished it was, a pointer sort of works if you're really close up, but these are brain sections from people affected by this condition. And these brown splodges you can see are abnormal forms of this protein tau that you may have heard of in dementia. And while we see it in other dementias like Alzheimer's disease and other conditions, what sets it apart is these very distinctive brown splodges. It's localized patches of disease. In things like Alzheimer's disease, it tends to affect the brain more diffusely, so more uniformly. But here we see these brown splotches and patches, quite distinctive. And that really gave us the definition that we could take off to our mortuaries and we could start looking for this pathology, see if we could find it, see where we could see it. And where we see it, or where we have seen it, is essentially just in circumstances where people have an exposure to brain injury, often in relation to sport. So we saw the first American football description in 2005. I think I published the first rugby player in 2014. But since then, we've seen many, many more cases, unfortunately, come to us of footballers and rugby players with this pathology, which is fascinating. I'm a pathologist. Of course, this is fascinating. It's fascinating to me. But what I'm describing is a subtlety down a microscope. And the question that we kept being asked is, well, what does this mean? What does this subtle, odd pathology down a microscope mean in terms of dementia risk? Do footballers, do rugby players, do American footballers with this show any difference in terms of the dementia risk to the wider population? So we set out to try and answer that. And how we did that was we identified within Scotland professional footballers dating back to the early part of last century. And for every one of those professional footballers, we identified 3 people in the community who were male, because this is all male professional football we had data for, who were born in the same year and living in much the same areas, so the socioeconomic status was similar. So for every footballer, we found 3 controls, and then we went off to electronic health records, which we have in Scotland, and we interrogated these for information about what they were dying of and with. And when we did that, what we found was we had about 8,000 footballers to work with and about 23,000 or so, just over 23,000 controls. And when we looked at death-certification data, what we found was that the risk of a former footballer dying with the dementia syndrome was about 3.5 times higher than we might expect. And we were looking deeper into that at specific causes of disease. We found that Alzheimer's disease risk was higher, motor neuron disease risk was higher, Parkinson's disease risk was higher, but in slightly varying levels. So that was the first evidence that being a footballer might be a risk to brain health in later life. But that didn't really tell us much about whether it was to do with the sport or just being an athlete and getting into sport or something in the sport, like the head injuries and head impacts. So the next thing we did was we looked at specifics of our footballers, what position they played, how long they played for, when they were playing, and asked questions that did this influence their risk. And sure enough, when we do that, what we find out is if you're a goalkeeper who doesn't head the ball, why would they? They've got hands to save them having to head the ball. They do get occasional head injuries, but not nearly as frequently as other players on the pitch because they're not gliding in midair. When we look at that, the goalkeeper's risk was about the same as we'd expect from the wider population. So not exposed to head injury, head impact, risk about the same as we'd expect. But when we went out to the players playing outfield, particularly defenders, risk was higher. So these are positions where there's heading, head impacts, head injury. Didn't matter when you played the game of football over the last century, risk was much the same. But the longer you played the game of football, the higher your risk. So if you had a long career, you had very much higher risk of developing neurodegenerative disease in later life. And we've seen this data develop in other sports as well. So in American football, there's some data been around showing similar things, that there's a risk of neurodegenerative disease, that it varies depending on subtype. And last year, or just over a year ago, we also published some data in a rugby cohort showing much the same thing, about a 3-fold increased risk of neurodegenerative disease if you participated at elite level rugby. Now, this is all very well. This is leading us to where we are now in research, because this is really research at the time that the diagnosis has been made. So we're towards the end of life, and we're seeing these higher risk of degenerative diseases. And our hypothesis for some time has been that essentially as we age, that you accumulate pathologies in the brain. Now they might be the vascular pathologies that Craig's talking about, or the amyloid pathologies, or the tau pathologies, or inflammatory pathologies, but these pathologies accumulate in the brain. And that's a part of aging. And at some point, that pathology gets to a stage where you develop symptoms, you develop signs, you develop the disease which you can recognize. And what we think happens is that you get exposed to an insult like a big brain injury, a road traffic accident, or sports with lots of little brain injuries, and you just change the course of that disease trajectory. So you accumulate pathology more often, earlier. Think of like the CADE score, where perhaps being in sport at this level gives you an extra couple of points on your risk score. Doesn't mean you're definitely going to get it, it just means your risk goes up. And it's probably reflective in this background pathology. Now, much of research, as Craig was talking about earlier this morning, in dementia over the years has been focused on this bit when the disease presents. At this point, where we saw the data coming forward about risk amongst athletes, we started asking questions, well, maybe what we need to do is get to the point before the disease presents. Maybe there's something we could learn about the development of this condition, the risks, the additional risks of the condition, more importantly, how we might prevent it if we could go back in life to before the disease presenting, so in midlife. Now, this is where I was in about 2017, 18, as we were seeing our data come through on athletes, we're seeing our pathology data, seeing our epidemiological data, those numbers on risk. And I was sitting with a plan for a study on how we might look into midlife and figure out what were the changes in a rugby player's brain, a footballer's brain, that distinguished it from aging in other circumstances. And the most important part of all of this research is yes, looking at the brains of people who are at risk, so looking at footballers and rugby players. The most important part is looking at people who are aging normally. And so I was left with this bit on my sheet of paper saying, I need normal aging, I need controls. And I just happened to be at a meeting in Edinburgh around about this time, and Craig presented the Prevent Dementia programme. And I thought, that is exactly what I need to do. I need to get this Prevent Dementia programme, I need to get this guy, Craig Ritchie, into a corner somewhere and convince him that we should improve the study, we should enhance the study by adding former rugby players and footballers to it. It didn't take much persuasion, I think. I don't think I even had to buy a pint. I just had to chat. And so from the back of that, that's where this study has gone. Now, we're being cautious here because think back to my first slide where there's litigation, there's media, there's headlines, there's all sorts of challenges behind this. So we need to be really careful and cautious in how we work with our data, present our data, and it takes time. Now, we finished our rugby recruitment, 61 rugby players. We finished that recruitment last October-ish. Yeah, thanks, looking at people who do all the hard work. We finished that last October. Our football study is in the process of recruiting. We're about a third of the way through that. We should hopefully finish that by the end of this year, this time next year, around about then. And we'll start to produce papers from both of those. And we'll be following them up. We're already talking about our rugby participants when we start bringing them back for the next follow-up. But in the meantime, what Craig and I, one of the things that impressed me when I was, not just the research Craig was doing, but also that it's putting research into practice, putting our experience into practice as soon as possible. And this is a really important issue. These are individuals who we're identifying who might be at high risk. So we can't just sit back and say and do nothing. So we're working on ways of educating people. So we've got this massive open online course, is that what MOOC stands for? Which you're all welcome to sign up for and take, sport, exercise in the brain, talking about physical activity and brain health. We have this research which we're conducting, which is bringing in our footballers to try and understand what's happening in midlife and find ways of altering trajectory of disease, modifying those other risk factors that might reduce their risk. And also, we've got a brain health clinic. Craig's leading a brain health clinic through Murrayfield to actually bring in former players who may or may not have issues and sit down and have a conversation with them and talk about how they might improve their brain health. So we're taking this straight back into action as soon as possible. And I shall pause there before we bring Gill and Jason up. So thank you. Think back, when I played rugby, I was going to medical school, and then I got involved in medicine, got involved in my career in neuropathology, and got involved in science. I never thought there'd be a day where I would be standing introducing two legends of rugby. A pinch myself moment. So we've got Gill Burns, who is a former English internationalist and World Cup winner. Captain the England team to World Cup in 1994, is that right?
I didn't captain for the World Cup win, but I did become England captain in 94.
Take it. Yeah, take it. And we were talking about this, that people talk, England won the World Cup. England have won the World Cup, but they always talk about the England men's team winning the World Cup. Not the forerunners to that, the real pioneers who won the World Cup. 1994, some 9 years before the men got round to doing it. So Gill, and next to Gill was Jason White, who was an exceptionally good, you should blush with this, an exceptionally good player for Scotland. Through the 2000s to early 10,
2000 was my first cap and my last one was 2009.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time in Murrayfield shouting encouragement, largely encouragement, to the Scottish team, and Jason didn't need it, nor did he need the criticism that I could offer him, because he didn't need any of that. And Jason also has he's also raising a cup there, a very important cup. That's the Calcutta Cup from 2006, maybe.
Yeah, that was, yeah. So I was fortunate enough to win it 3 times. My first cap in 2000, sorry to mention, 2000, 2006 and 2008. Yeah, so it's the cup. When Scotland play England, the Calcutta Cup is the prize that you're going for.
So, I mean, in modern rugby, you know, people seem to think that this Calcutta Cup winning side from the current era is somehow, you know, a marvellous team that is doing something that's never been done before. Back then, we used to win it fairly regularly because, you know, meeting England wasn't really much of a challenge for us, was it? Anyway, moving on, yeah. I actually forgot we're south of the border just for a minute there. Apologies, we're in London, yeah, I'll be careful what I'm saying. Anyway, so, Jason, let's start with you. Going back, obviously, you know, Six Nations starts today, and it's going to be really interesting watching what happens in the next few weeks. You know, there's an attention on female sport, rugby, which there hasn't been for many years. And back when you were participating, there really wasn't the same focus on the game. But I guess also there wasn't the same of medical care when you were playing at the elite level rugby.
Well, way back, I think I got my first cap in October 1988. The women's game was completely amateur. We like to think we were professional with a little p because we trained every day. We still got knocked over several times a week and did get those sort of head injuries that we were, to be honest, quite naive about at the time. We didn't have the same structure that they have with the governing body at the moment that really looks after players. In those days, we looked after ourselves, and in fact, one of our first sort of doctors for the team was an ex-player who just was a doctor and gave up her own time and paid for herself to travel with the team. And you know, if we got a bit dizzy during the game, you know, she'd look into your eyes and just keep an eye on you. I mean, the one time I remember getting a concussion injury and was seeing double. I actually played on, which obviously wouldn't happen now, thankfully. I played a game against France away, we won. I scored 2 tries and I have no memory whatsoever of the 2 tries that I scored afterwards. It was just a blur. And the doctor sat with me for the entire night. I mean, she was doing her best for me at the time and sat with me, you know, but in hindsight, really, I should have walked from the pitch, but we were naive, we didn't know. But touch wood, personally, I don't recall having too many concussion injuries, just that one, really. But we were completely amateur, so the international players were looking after themselves as best they could at the time.
But at the pinnacle of the game, then obviously winning World Cups. So you were as elite as women's rugby got then.
Yeah,
but with, you know, looking after yourselves in terms of managing injuries.
Yeah, and to be honest, every time there was a World Cup, the standards improved with regard to looking after player welfare. So the first one was in 91, then 94, 98 and 2002. I played in 4. And by the end of that 4th World Cup, yeah, the standards of care were so much better.
And I guess that's kind of round about the year that Jason was kind of, you know, entering the elite level. Just for contrast, what was this medical care that you saw?
I thought it was, we were excellent. It was, we were very fortunate that you'd have doctors, physios. If you had to go and get an X-ray, you would get fast-tracked into X-rays, MRIs were all done, sort of express lane type stuff. On-pitch care was excellent. And probably the biggest thing probably for the rugby players is you needed to be protected from yourself. So I think you would want to go back on the pitch. You would want to probably push the boundaries so that you could be on the pitch. And I think that's probably, since I've stopped playing in 2012 to now, is I think the best thing is that the decision is taken out of the player's hands.
And Jason, did you have experience that you could recall of concussions or?
So I probably had quite a few concussions. I think probably in terms of what I would say probably big ones, maybe 3 or 4. Probably I discussed with my wife on the way down as to probably the biggest one was Scotland played Fiji November test in 2002, and the test, James Robson, who was really, really super doc came on, gave me a number between 1 and 10, and apparently I said 17. Thankfully, I was taken off the pitch, and that was me stood down. And then that following week, Beverly and I moved in as boyfriend and girlfriend for the first time in Glasgow. And apparently, I sat down on the sofa and would do nothing to contribute at all. So I think Beverly was having second thoughts whether or not she was making the right decision to move in with me. And that, thankfully, I was probably stood down for about 6 weeks. So that was probably the big one, playing for Scotland. Had a couple playing club rugby in England and a couple playing club rugby in France. But it got probably the thing where I probably needed to be protected from myself. I needed to say to the physio, give me the smelling salts, because I really enjoyed the physical nature of the game and going in and tackling hard. And there were times where if you get it wrong, what you would probably describe as having your bell rung or seeing stars, and just taking a moment to compose yourself. And I would probably have played on, whereas now it's recognised as an HIA, head impact assessment, and the players are taken off. I don't know what the tests are, but they do some form of test off the field. There's a decision whether they're able to come back on or whether they stay off the game.
It's interesting actually, because Craig and I both did the same thing there when you were talking about, you know, meeting the family for the first time and you had acute concussion symptoms and how you couldn't contribute much, and we both, but it's not funny. I mean, you know, you had problems with memory, problems with function, which is what worries us. You know, that's the kind of anxiety.
I'm very disinhibited. I think Beverly had said I was in hospital and I was swearing and I wouldn't normally swear, and just a real sort of change in personality.
Yeah. And as well as those, these are the kind of injuries you remember. But what about the physicality of the game round about? I mean, you know, feeling that your head was in the wrong place. You wore a cap, didn't you? You said you wore a scrum cap, Jill.
I did. I mean, the reason why I wore a cap was to avoid head injury at the time, but it was also to look after my long hair, because when I used to put electric tape round, I'd end up ripping out loads of hair as well. So it was, and I also didn't want cauliflower ears. So there were 3 reasons why I wore the head guard, but that was only in the latter stages of my playing career. To start off with, you just went out with a bit of electric tape round your ears, and when you just mentioned the word whiplash, every Monday and Tuesday morning was the effect like having a car crash. That feeling in your neck was there every week. After games, certainly after elite games, you felt like you'd been in some sort of traumatic accident after every match, really. Yeah.
Physical game.
So there was always some sort of whiplash feeling.
Jason, you in training, what was the training like when you were?
At different points of the week and at different points of the season, probably the coaches would, at times, if you didn't play very well, it would get out on the pitch and you would absolutely batter into each other, and that would be a way of trying to fix it. So that's been a definite change of when I trained to what they do now. I think there's a now sort of real recognition that they should only do a certain amount of contact in a week, whereas you'd maybe spend an hour and a half going sort of live in a really short channel. Like they would make the channel as small as possible so that the chance of contact was really high. I'm sure you probably had the same, Jill. And so there's a benefit to that, and you've got lots of repetitions in either how you tackle, how you clear out, or just sort of replicating what would happen in a game, and that would be quite common. But I, as a rugby player, I love that part of the game, and there'll be a lot of young boys and girls who come up and they love that. So it needs to be, I think, the coaches, the governing bodies who regulate the type of training and they put the restrictions on, because I would have done that every day of the week, probably as a younger player. Yeah. And then when I came to the end of my career, I know that I couldn't do it because my joints and my tendons and everything were
I mean, it's interesting that, because one of the things that we've obviously had seen in the last several years, and I think it's been a success of communicating and research and sitting down with the governing bodies, is we've seen a drop in the number of contact sessions during the week. In rugby and in football, so football does far less heading during the week than they used to, and rugby is trying to limit how much contact there is and go back to the gum shields. They're using the gum shields to gather that data to figure out where the limitations can be. Just out of interest, do you really feel you benefited from the heavy contact sessions during the week? Were you not carrying then fatigue and injuries into Saturdays?
I don't think we benefited much. The classic one would always be you would if you'd have 2 packs if you play in the forwards, they would go against each other, or the A team versus the B team, and you would generally get a doing from the B team if you're in the A team because they were motivated. They would probably target the player who was in their position. So, yeah, not very beneficial.
No, which is I think how rugby has realised that you could probably get rid of it. I mean, when Gregor Townsend, I think it was one of the early things that he brought in was cutting back on contact during the week because he realised that the players looked a bit fresher on a Saturday, which is probably helpful. I don't know if he's
for rugby, and I'm sure there'll be studies on this as to where the head impacts come but to tackle, you need to make sure that you've got your head on the right side and you hit with your shoulder and you wrap your arms properly. So the coaches have had to find ways of learning a new skill whilst not doing it, sort of breaking it down, doing it with pads, wearing protective clothing. So that they've been challenged in their coaching styles. Well,
thank you very much. Thank you to Gill and to Jason for taking time out, for participating in the study at first.
Just add one thing, just to reassure all the English people in the room. The women played against Scotland 10 times when I was playing. England 9, Scotland 1.
I'm not applauding that. I'm not applauding that.
I won't take the bait, Joe.
I'm not applauding that. Things will change, maybe not this Six Nations, but very soon. I thank you, despite what just happened. I thank Joe and Jason for participation and fielding the questions. Thank you very much. Thanks.